Welcome to Oh God What Now? I'm Jacob Jarvis, and on today's show, as the Tories face another racism row, we imagine what would it be like if the Conservative Party simply ceased to exist. Plus, according to new research, the only nation more miserable than the UK is Uzbekistan. Why are we so unhappy, other than, well, you don't need me to tell you why. And in the extra bit for our supporters, the bizarre fallout over Kate's edited photo had us all acting a bit Kieron. We discuss how weird that all was. Now let's meet the panel. First up, it's Rachel Cunliffe, an Oh God What Now regular and associate political editor of The New Statesman. Hi, Rachel.
Hello.
Downing Street went through quite a journey on Tuesday, let's say. At 9 a.m, Mel Stride said that the comments allegedly made by megadonor Frank Hester about Diane Abbott weren't race-based. At 11:30 a.m, Number 10 wouldn't tell the lobby if Sunak thought the comments were racist. Then at 4 p.m, Kemi Badenoch said they were racist, and lo and behold, by 7:30 p.m, Sunak thought so too. How do you describe what went on here? It was such a shit show. Is it ignorance, arrogance? I don't know.
Yes. all of the above. The interesting thing about this, horrifying, hilarious, if you're on the other side of it, is everyone could see how it was going to play out. It's very difficult to imagine a series of comments that were more definitively racist than the comments that Frank Hester allegedly made, although he hasn't denied making them. He called for Diane Abbott to be shot, and he said that she made him hate all black women. That's kind of the definition of racism, taking one individual who you don't like and extrapolating from that across a whole subsection of society. It was pretty obvious where it was going to go, and it was pretty obvious that the line wasn't going to hold. Pretty obvious to everyone other than Rishi Sunak, who sent his ministers out in a really embarrassing position. If you were speaking to Conservative MPs that day, privately, they were all like, obviously it's racist, obviously this line isn't going to hold. And lo and behold, it didn't, but only after it had dominated the news for an entire day and really upset a lot of people within the party, let alone outside of the party, who were looking on at this and going, this is pretty horrifying.
Also, on one thing we could all predict, Kemi Badenoch coming out and just outflanking Sunak as well. I mean, in this instance, saying something that, needed to be said and was obviously right. But how does he keep just getting beaten by members of his own cabinet?
Kemi is interesting because a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was that Sunak made those comments about Keir Starmer not knowing what a woman was, and obviously Esther Jai, the mother of the murdered teenager Brianna, was in Parliament that day, and there was a lot of pressure on Sunak to kind of apologise for that. And while Number 10 were kind of dithering and working out what their line was, Kemi Badenoch came out and said he shouldn't apologise, like it was absolutely fine. And then on this, Number 10 were dithering about what the line should be, and Kemi Badenoch came out and said, of course it was wrong. So it does feel like the Downing Street line is being led to some extent by what Kemi Badenoch puts out on her Twitter feed. And she's pretty strident, she's quite punchy, she's sort of known for doing that. I don't know if she's like, rather than the good cop, bad cop, if they have a kind of dithering cop and active, and she's the active one who just kind of goes straight in there, and it doesn't feel like leadership. But obviously, once she'd said that as a black female Conservative MP, there was no way that Downing Street could continue to say, oh, it wasn't racist.
Next up on the panel, it's political comedian and Oh God What Now regular Matt Green. Hello, Matt.
Hello.
Hester reportedly said that he made a lot of jokes about racism, which I'm not sure means whether that means racist jokes or not. I can't quite tell. But as someone who produces comedy for a living, does someone using joking as an excuse to just be an utter wanker particularly rub you up the wrong way?
It's always the most annoying thing. It's the thing that people will always say, I'm just joking, mate, I'm just joking. And it's, from the kind of the thug on the train platform who's kind of poking somebody, I'm just joking, That's sort of, that's always the instinct to immediately go, no, it's, it wasn't serious. I've always thought that you can make jokes about anything and anyone, as long as you're clear about what there are two things you've got to be clear about. Who the victim is of the joke. Most jokes have some sort of victim in this kind of case. So are you punching up, as we say? Are you taking aim at sort of higher status people? Are you punching down, attacking sort of minorities, that kind of thing? And generally, people think that punching up is better, funnier, less likely to cause offence. And most crucially, who is the audience of the joke? And in this situation, the audience was his employees.
Yeah, it feels like the power dynamic was totally off there.
The dynamic, like you can, obviously, we all know that you can joke about sort of anything within your mates and within your friendship group. But if you're in a power dynamic like that, then obviously, clearly, if his staff felt offended, they didn't feel like they were able to say anything about it for whatever reason, probably just social sort of awkwardness. And the other thing is, just because something's a joke doesn't mean that your audience has to find it funny. And I think in this situation, it hasn't. My favourite thing about this whole sort of situation is the joke. The funniest thing about it is that he said these things at a meeting that had been called because of accusations of racism. Like, so he was sort of trying to sort of calm it down and say, yes, this didn't happen, but, and then he said the racist thing, and you sort of go, well, how did it reminded me of this amazing scene in a Scottish comedy show called Scot Squad, where the sort of chief inspector is trying to do an apology for something, and he keeps apologizing for one thing and then saying something bad about something else, and keeps having to do the same apology again and again and again for different groups. And it felt like that. It feels like every time this sort of situation happens, they kind of keep making the same mistake again and again. And they definitely made the same mistake, which is, if he said this 5 years ago in a meeting, he probably said other stuff a bit like this in other situations. And I think it's probably likely they've got details of that already. And you've already seen that today, that they've brought out another example of that. Surely The Guardian's got at least 3 more. They're going to sort of drip it out for the rest of the week. So, I can't believe that they've fallen for it again.
Finally, you might have heard her on our sister podcast, Paper Cuts, but today she's making her Oh God What Now debut. It's political correspondent for Politics Joe, Ava Santina. So Sunak had to face PMQs amid all of this that is going on. Did he clarify his stance and clear the whole mess up like he always manages to in PMQs, or not quite?
Did Sunak manage to clear it up? PMQs on Wednesday was a really uncomfortable watch because it was a lot of mudslinging, and it was a lot of, it was sort of a competition between the two leaders of who has the least racist party, and neither of them came out of that looking particularly good. I mean, the worst part of Prime Minister's questions today was Diane Abbott, who is obviously the centre of this entire debacle, this entire attack, was bobbing. And bobbing is when you are standing up trying to get a question, trying to ask a question, you're trying to attract the speaker's attention. And the speaker didn't choose her. The speaker didn't select her. And he selected a lot of men around her to speak on her behalf, and particularly a lot of white men to speak for her. And that was a really uncomfortable watch. So you've got 2 men in the centre of the room talking about how neither of them are racist, and the actual victim of it is completely voiceless and completely devoid of agency.
So I want you to conduct a thought experiment with me, if you will. If it's safe for you to do so, close your eyes and imagine if the Conservative Party simply ceased to exist. You wouldn't ever hear from Liz Truss, Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg ever again. No longer would you hear the phrase trickle-down economics, and nobody would ever say anything nice about Margaret Thatcher. But would total political oblivion for the Tories truly leave our politics in a better state?
Can I just check? Is that ASMR?
Yeah, I was going for some real. That's why I was getting really close to the mic. I thought it was like FBPE ASMR, actually, in fact. You're getting all the letters in there. So, Rachel, does it feel like a confluence of MPs leaving and an imminent electoral trouncing could end up as an extinction level event for the Tories?
It is something that some Conservatives are really worried about. I don't know how likely it is, but there are certain trends that are making Conservative MPs, and particularly Conservative advisors and strategists, really worried. One of them is just the sheer state of the polls and how badly it looks that they're going to lose. There's this there's been this kind of, where do we focus our attention? Do we focus it on the traditional blue Tory heartland that are at risk from the Lib Dems? Do we focus it on keeping the red wall that Boris Johnson won in 2019? And over the last 6 months, I'd say that's not even a discussion anymore. They're just accepting that they have lost the red wall, and now it's, okay, how can we minimise the damage elsewhere? So that's one thing that's really worrying them. The other thing that I think is worrying them on a really existential level is about age. And we know that older people tend to vote Tory and younger people generally don't. The age at which people switch from left-leaning to right-leaning is going up. Boris Johnson brought it down very slightly in 2019, but the trend is upwards. But more worrying than that is a sort of new school of thought that says actually this idea that people go on this journey where you start off really radical and left-leaning and you become a Tory at about 45 and a very, very devout Tory, shall we say, at sort of the age of 65, may not be the case. And there's evidence instead that people's voting preferences are actually set in a sort of generational cohort. And so if you are someone in their 20s and 30s who is saying now that they're not going to vote Tory basically ever, which is I think only 18% of that cohort, so they'd even consider voting Tory, that sort of sets. And if you take that to its natural conclusion, those people get older, they still don't vote Tory, all the Conservative voters age and eventually die, suddenly you've got no voter base whatsoever, and you've got Tory strategists who are really, really worried about that.
So it's a worry for some people, obviously, but in another way, could it be a sense of relief to some MPs and some Conservatives more broadly who have just thought, fucking hell, it's got to a point that this is embarrassing, it's going nowhere, it's not a vehicle for anything at the moment, it's just sort of, it's so stagnant that maybe some people might think, hey, burn it down, start again?
I mean, if you want to answer that question, you might want to have a look at what happened to Labour over the last decade. Yeah. And was there a sense during that period where Labour was polling really badly and suffering election defeats? And was there a sense that it would be better if the Labour Party just ceased to exist, or if half the party split off into another party? And I think the majority of Labour MPs, aside from the ones who did split off to join Change UK, the independent group,
which did really well.
Yeah. But I think most Labour people would say, no, actually, it's quite good that the Labour Party still exists. So I think you would struggle to find Conservatives who think that the Conservative Party shouldn't exist.
Lee Anderson's departure has obviously caused a bit of a shitstorm, really. Let's describe it as that. You wrote a piece asking how dangerous this is for the Tories. So how dangerous is this for the Tories?
So it's not great. I don't think it's as existentially dangerous as some people are making out to be, because I don't think that Lee Anderson was particularly helpful for the Tories when he was in the party. And I think Marie Leconte, who's a regular guest on this show, kind of said it best when there were obvious signs right from when Lee Anderson became an MP that he was going to be a bit of a loose cannon, as many backbenchers are. And the mistake that the Conservatives made, the mistake that Rishi Sunak made, was elevating him to the role of vice party chairman, which gave him this tremendous platform to really build his own brand, which is what he's done. And now it's not some random backbench MP who got suspended and went off to reform. It's a former deputy party chair. So I think they could definitely see this coming. I think, though, in terms of what it means for where the party is at the moment, Lee Anderson got suspended and then spent 2 weeks dithering and eventually went off and joined Reform. I don't think that him doing that causes more trouble for Sunak than just having him suspended, which is the position that they were in before.
This is a bumper question from But Your Emails. So it's from one of our patrons, Sarah B, who asked, gossip time, who else looks likely to join the 30p brigade? Who are whips currently running around? Do you think anyone else is going to follow suit, or was that just blown up? It was sort of talk of up to 9, which I really quite liked as phrasing.
Yeah,
one is up to 9.
One is up to 9. Yeah, this was Chris Hope at GB News, and I saw that and I was like, you're just repeating the Reform line here. I really think that if more were going to go, they'd go together en masse, because that makes the biggest statement. The fact that they haven't yet tells you something. I'd keep an eye on Brenda Clark-Smith, who was the other deputy chair who resigned with Lee Anderson so he could rebel on an amendment about the Rwanda bill, and is another Red Wall MP who looks almost certain to lose his seat. So keep an eye on them. But generally, I mean, Lee Anderson was a Labour councillor until just before he ran to be a Conservative MP. Most people who are Conservative MPs have quite a deep history in the party. They might not like the direction the party is currently going in, but they see that as the issue of the current Conservative Party not being conservative enough, not that they do not see themselves as conservative. And they believe that if they stay, they can change the party back to what they think it ought to be. I interviewed Sir John Hayes, one of the right-wing firebrands, who is often brought up when you talk about right-wing Tory rebels. And I asked him about defecting to Reform, and he sort of gave me a look and was like, I've been a member of the Conservative Party since I was 14, very, very nice that Reform is saying all the things that I've been saying for decades, but, this is my party.
Yeah.
So, no, I don't think there's going to be a flurry of defections, but we'll see.
Boris Johnson is apparently being brought back as a campaign weapon, and Cameron's already been pulled into the fold of this current government. Both of these characters really represent failure for the Tories in some form, and now they're being used as kind of heroes brought back to, save them in some sort of way. I mean, Johnson particularly, how's it come to this?
It reminds me of just before the 2019 election, and I was working at a radio station, and I got a call from CCHQ. And as you do when you're working at a radio station, you're regularly you're being offered guests quite often because you've got many, many slots to fill. And I was offered Douglas Carswell. And I said to the person who phoned me, I said, well, why are you offering me Douglas Carswell? He's UKIP and you are CCHQ. And he was like, it doesn't matter. Like, he'll come on and he'll speak for the Conservatives. And I was like, okay, well, this is bloody interesting. I am going to, great, he can come on. I think the similarity there is that Douglas Carswell was willing to say the sort of things that perhaps Boris Johnson shouldn't be saying or didn't want to say. So he would have been able to pull the narrative a bit further to the right and scoop up some of we weren't really in kind of full culture war there, but the little bit more xenophobic side of that voters sometimes are attracted to. And he was really good for doing that. Now with Boris, he's quite similar to that because he's able to go to places and rally voters and get them excited. And there are large swathes of the country that do believe he didn't do anything wrong for the past couple of years and that he should have always been Prime Minister. And so he serves function for them. Yeah. He can go as, kind of, oh my God, I've forgotten her name. Who was Whitecliffs of Dover who used to go and rally the troops?
What
was her name? Vera Lynn. He's like Vera Lynn for the Red Wall.
Yeah, God, that's the highest compliment that Boris Johnson's ever got on this podcast. Well, is that kind of the issue then? They've got meat puppets, obviously, at the moment. It will just go out and say the stuff that they want them to say. But is it that none of their meat puppets have any charisma and can't think on their feet? And I suppose at least Boris Johnson can kind of react quite well and do something. People seem to like him and engage with him, unlike these people who have to go on TV and go, it's not racist because it's not, because I was told it's not. It's wrong.
Do you know, I actually think that Boris Johnson is one of the most terrible people in interviews. I think that he reacts on the hoof really badly. I think that he doesn't, when we got that iconic moment where he started talking about how he was painting buses, and it was all because he was evading actually some quite softball questions that came from a journalist that ended up actually working in his administration. Don't know how that ended up, that train ended up happening. But anyway, I don't think he's particularly good at it.
He hid in the fridge.
He did hide in the fridge. Yeah.
And he didn't come to the interviews with Andrew Neil and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, but I think you're right. I think he's sort of superficially very charismatic and sort of funny and stuff. But he'll definitely do at least one gaffe per day. Yeah, won't he? He'll definitely say at least one thing that they have to kind of row back on or have to defend in some way.
Yeah. I'm glad you all pushed back on me, going, could it be that the Tories have been somewhat smart slightly? And you were like, no, not at all. That's not happening. With the government at the moment as well, is the idea of it sort of almost. Obviously, they very much are in charge of a lot of things, but the idea and the feeling of them feeling in charge is almost obsolete. We just have a set of ministers that things happen to and then they react. They're not actually doing stuff on the front foot very much anymore. Yeah, and importantly, they're not even really in Parliament. I mean, after Prime Minister's questions on a Wednesday, a significant number of them go home because there's nothing happening. I mean, definitely this week, there's nothing going on Thursday or Friday, apart from maybe a couple of private members' bills. The only piece of legislation that they're actually really working on is the post office scandal. That is actually something that they are, that they're actually doing. But I mean, we heard about a prisoners bill that was meant to be going through. There's Rishi Sunak's smokers ban that was meant to be going through. Like there's no actual legislation being legislated. Yeah. They're all sort of back in their constituencies twiddling their thumbs. And I think
perhaps that's even an argument of where all these splits and factions are coming from, because no one's got any actual policy to focus on. They just need to, they've got a lot of time to keep squabbling.
Well, they're waiting for it to either be in an ITV drama or on Kemi Badenoch's Twitter feed. That's the pipeline now. Matt, is your gut instinct to want this lot to just totally disappear? And would complete political annihilation for the Tories feel optimal?
It's going to take a minute to just take that in. I mean, yeah, obviously, in some ways, I would love that to happen. From one perspective, it would be great for the Tories to be punished for what's happened over the last 14 plus years, But I suppose it does feel like a kind of bit of a monkey's paw situation of be careful what you wish for. Because I think the danger is that, that what comes in their place is even worse and is even less anchored to conservatism and becomes kind of more radical right, becomes more of a kind of it's already, I think, become quite a radical right party, but even more so, and push out any of the kind of voices of moderation. And I think, I suppose I just do worry that if Labour wins, even if it wins quite a big majority, that they are sounding quite sort of downbeat about really being able to do very much in the next few years. Which hopefully is just expectation management, and they've got some amazing plans that are going to be incredible. But if they can't really turn things around, then there is a danger that what happens here is what's happened all around Europe. Lots of right parties have taken control, and that feels like a strong possibility. Particularly, if Trump comes in, all this kind of stuff. It feels like there's a possibility for a real sort of right shift, and Labour could be sort of bucking the trend, but the question is, how long would that last for?
Would the hope really be that the Tories are a party that are wanting to try and get to the same aim, but in a different way to Labour? If you understand what I mean, in that I'd like to think that I didn't have to dislike the Tories. They just think the best way to get to the greater good for the most people, they just think that happens in a different way to how I think, but that we all want at the end of the day the best for the most people. Is that kind of...
Yes. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I suppose, I guess it depends on how much you think people are working in good faith at the moment. Yeah. And I think at the moment, unfortunately, there's a lot of bad faith around. And the Tory party that we had 5 years ago is not really the same as the Tory party we have now. It has been eaten from the inside by UKIP and all that sort of thing. And the fact that Reform is now sort of challenging them on the right doesn't give me much hope that they're going to somehow pull themselves to the left. It feels like they're just going to get dragged even further to the right. Yeah,
well, it does seem also, I saw some pollsters saying that Tory centrism would actually be more calamitous for them electorally at this point too.
I find that strange. Like, I talking to a friend of mine who does vote Conservative, who has a podcast about it, and I was talking to him about it, and he said, all of his listeners who are quite, a bit more Tory, they all think, well, the Tories aren't Conservative anymore. They're all left-wing socialists, and I genuinely can't get my head around that. But it's sort of that is the narrative now. Is that they're basically Labour, and Labour are basically the Tories, and so we just have to kind of go totally to one side or the other. And I think that's what happens when you get sort of polarisation.
Rachel, if there were no Tory party, where do you think the voters would actually go? What does it look like?
I think a lot of them wouldn't, and I think you're going to see that in the next election, because there's a big question: what happens to all the people who voted Tory in 2019? Some of them have died because the Tory. And it's seriously though, because because Tory vote are older, as I said. That some of them and some of the voters who are voting now weren't able to vote in 2019. Some of them are switching directly to Labour. Some of them are switching to Reform, or indeed to the Lib Dems and those kind of leafy southern shires where they're really upset about issues like water management and sewage, and a house building as well, annoyingly, because the Lib Dems managed to be like pro-house building on a national scale and anti-house building anywhere specific. But I think what you're mostly seeing, and you're seeing it both in the polls and in the by-elections, is they just don't turn up to vote. And Tory apathy is going to be the big cohort, I think, in the election. So I think I can't quite get my head around this idea of the Conservative Party just not existing, and maybe that's because I'm just very unimaginative. But it is the oldest party. It has existed in some form since the mid-18th century. It has been through so many different iterations of what it believes and doesn't believe. It has gone away and thought about things and come back, and it has traditionally been, they love to say it's a broad church. I think at the moment, the broadness of that church is really quite apparent, and you're sort of wondering if it's the same church at all. But historically, it is really good at that. And I think you've got to think about some of the basic, boring nuts and bolts of being a political party. You have members, you have data on people who voted for you in the past, you have people you can mobilise to go and hand out leaflets, you have donors and legacy donations.
You've got loads of clubs.
Got clubs
Everywhere. Conservative clubs are everywhere.
And often the Conservative clubs are more about, this is my husband, who was once a Conservative member, says the Conservative club used to be where you went to meet a nice young lady or gentleman from your background to possibly marry them. Like there's a whole structure around parties, and I don't think you can replicate that with something snazzy and new. Just because the current iteration of the mainstream one is in such a dire position.
And Reform isn't a party, is it?
No.
Well,
you can't really be a member.
You can just
give
pay,
them money.
You give them money.
Yeah.
How's comedy going to cope if there's no Conservative Party, if it doesn't exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone who works in comedy who has a sort of political angle it'll take us a beat. I think we will take a few days to think about it. I think it'll take a while to reorientate. I think my only experience of this happening would be, I guess, the 97 Labour landslide, and seeing how comedy at the time did take a while to work out what it was doing, and people like Armando Iannucci ended up doing things like the Friday Night Armistice, which was great and actually was very good at satirising Labour. And they found, and then obviously the thick of it became like the gold standard for how to satirise Labour at the time. So there will definitely be ways to make fun of things. It's just finding what the angles will be. It won't be the obvious kind of attack lines. But generally, I think comedy will be fine, because our news cycle is so fast and so frenetic that Labour are going to fuck loads of stuff up. The Tories will still be mad and doing things.
Aren't you tired though, as well? Aren't you tired of like the relentless, every single week there's something so ridiculous that if you're trying to satirise it, it must be quite exhausting because they're taking your bit from you.
Yeah, sometimes. I've been on tour, which has been quite nice. So I've had a bit of a gap, in a way, a bit of a break from like the relentlessness of what's happening day to day and just doing my show. But I do also think, for me personally as well, I think for all of us who do sort of online stuff, we don't have anyone breathing down our necks saying you have to do this. So you can just go, do you know what? I'm just going to not do a video today. I'm just going to leave it. I think if I was, a salaried person who had to make a video every day and had to kind of do a new thing, eventually you would get very bored of it and very sort of overwhelmed by it. But I'm able to say, yes, this is a mad story, but I'm actually going to not talk about this one.
It's mad enough on its own.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that one, and I'm going to let everyone else talk about it.
Ava, Matt just provided the balance of the podcast there, saying that Labour will fuck up at some point as well. But if Labour does win a landslide, kind of the like we've never seen before, do you feel like they're robust enough to handle being that politically dominant?
The problem that Labour have, and the problem that the left has, is how many factions that is composite of the Labour Party. So as we just spoke about there, the Conservatives describe themselves as a broad church. And even though it's extremely broad, actually so broad that it could be probably 5 different parties, they do tend to whip themselves quite well. So even when we saw that cataclysmic Rwanda vote a couple of months ago, and there were a couple of people who decided, including Lee Anderson, that I'm not going to vote in line with the whip. People like Mark Francois, who'd called this massive press conference and basically, taken up the entire news cycle of the day, ended up voting for the bill with the government that evening. Labour doesn't have that same ease. It just can't whip its party in that way. So even if it were to, hypothetically, taking some of the more ludicrous polls, achieve 420, 480 seats, 620 seats, how many, some of the more ridiculous ones are predicting, you still won't have a cohesive bills getting nodded through. MPs will be fighting against them.
My worry is that we'll have the Labour version of what we've had with this Tory party, where they didn't really expect to win such a big landslide. So there were just loads of candidates who they sort of shoved in then they won. And then that's why you end up with all these characters in Parliament who everyone's like, God, really? Are they an MP? And the danger is we have sort of the reverse of that, the reflection of that. Labour, lots of people who Keir Starmer's constantly having to go, well, I don't think we totally agree with that. And then it's, you end up with that kind of infighting thing, which, as you say, there's more of that generally in the Labour kind of DNA anyway.
Weirdly, like how the Tories at the moment feel like they're having their Corbyn moment.
Yeah.
But if Labour wins a massive majority, maybe they'll have their Boris Johnson moment.
Possibly, yeah.
Strange. Now let's have a question from one of our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you too can submit a question for the panel. Danny Dunning-Kruger, whose name I fear might be made up, asks, which political photograph from the past decade would the panel like to give Princess Kate to fix with her brilliant Photoshop skills? Matt, who are you giving an extra arm?
I think the obvious one is the Ed Miliband sandwich. I think there's all sorts of things you could do with that. Make him eating something else, make his face look less mad than it did. I looked at it again today and I was like, it's so amazing, that photo. I don't quite know how, anyway, it's an image everybody knows.
Well,
Rachel.
I have to go for Liz Truss in this huge armchair. This was when she was, I think, at DEFRA or possibly Lord Chancellor, so before she was Prime Minister or ex-Prime Minister, and she's got this big fluffy cat on her lap, and it is like she's posing as a Bond villain, but there's a bit of an Alice in Wonderland vibe to it as well, with the chair and the colours that she's wearing. And I think given the trajectory that she's been down, you could do a sort of Bond Mad Hatter mashup with that photo. That would be quite fun.
These are all good ideas for the Oh God What Now Twitter account. I hope someone's noted
I love
down.
how we're describing this on a podcast.
Yeah.
Visual jokes audio visual jokes.
Ava, what about you?
Okay, I'm going to flip it slightly. So there's a photo. It's when Boris Johnson is becoming out of favour with the Conservative Party, and there's letters of no confidence going in, and the tables are turning on public opinion of him. And Grant Shapps, who's the Transport Secretary, takes him to this spaceport, this aerospace, and he's showing him this amazing, ridiculous thing that's apparently going to go into space, and it's wonderful. It's British innovation. And he tweets the photo, and it's Boris Johnson and Grant Shapps. And then the photo appears again about half an hour later, and Boris Johnson is not in the photo. Yeah. He's just gone. So I would like to ask Kate, where is he? and what did he do to make him go away? Yeah,
I do enjoy it. That reminds me of like the Seinfeld episode where George finds he's in the background of one of his boss's photos and he has to Photoshop it out because he's sort of had a massive argument with him. And that was a very bizarre political moment there. For this section, I want to ask, firstly, are you okay? Well, probably not if new research is anything to go by. The UK has been declared the second most miserable place in the world. Only Uzbekistan ranked lower in a global mental well-being index from the Sapien Labs Mental State of the Year report released last week. And saying that sentence was damaging to my mental well-being right there. Rachel, what do they mean by miserable exactly? How do they measure it? And what stood out for you most in this research?
So the reason I'm staring at my phone is because I've got the way they did this study up on my phone and I'm struggling to understand it. But it was a series of 15-minute surveys, online surveys, and it utilises the mental health quotient, or MHQ, which captures perceptions of 47 aspects of mental capability and functioning on a life impact scale. Did anyone understand that?
I did it.
You did it?
Yeah, I did it in preparation of this. And I'm fine. So is that about
okay? You're not that miserable.
Yeah, I'm all right.
So how did it work in practice?
Well, it is. Yeah, it's like as Rachel said, it's like 47, 48 questions or something, and it's a classic sort of rate yourself on a scale from this affects me really badly to this is fine, and it's stuff about like how do you feel about this? How do you feel about your physical? How do you feel physically well? Do you feel like you live in a do you understand the world around you? Do you feel like you're struggling with this or that or the other? It did rank people from distressed to thriving in a sort of scale of how well you feel able to cope with life. I am possibly controversially, sorry, Matt, because you went and did it. I cannot take this study seriously. And the reason I cannot take this study seriously is because the UK scored below Yemen, which is a war zone. And in fact, Yemen scored higher than the UK, Ireland,
and Australia, which is sort of well known for being kind of sunnier and happier than the UK. And I feel like the study is definitely measuring something in terms of national attitudes. I'm not sure if what it's measuring is happiness. I looked and there was none of the Nordic countries were included, and that's relevant because Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, those are the Nordics, Iceland, they tend to do quite well, Norway and Sweden in particular, on things like well-being and happiness. None of them were included, but the only European country that did remotely well was Italy. All the others were right down the bottom, not as far as the UK. So I feel like something else was going on here.
Yeah, does it feel like a sort of nationwide personality test?
Yes,
almost.
exactly.
It's very comparative. It's very like, how do you feel about your ability to cope with your life? The graph I found very interesting was the graph that showed that as you go down the age ranges, basically people got less happy. So the top happiness rating was for people in their 60s, and then it was down 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s, which does suggest that they're not quite measuring the thing they think they're measuring, because surely that can't. I absolutely can buy into the idea that the current 20-year-olds are having a really shit time and have had a really shit time, and COVID and everything else, and climate change and all that kind of stuff. But I can't quite believe that it's that kind of stratified, that each age is definitely less happy than the previous one, and it feels therefore it's more about what they're. That people who are younger are sort of experiencing life in a slightly different way to people who are a bit older, and that may be a mental health thing, but it may be more about financial health and all sorts of other things.
The suggestion from the research is that politicians have to think more widely than just in kind of economic terms to see how a country's doing. I know money can't buy you happiness, but it does help, doesn't it? Is there a bit of a concern as well in this kind of thing that there are actually some core issues like the economy being really, really bad, particularly for young people who it seems are more miserable, which do need dealing with first? And it also doesn't seem to add up though as well, then the older people, I'm sure, basically if you're a young person or if you're a pensioner, that's where the economy is probably the most bad for you at the moment. And that maybe needs addressing initially.
Yeah, I mean, I thought there were two columns that have been out in the last couple of weeks, which I thought were quite interesting on this. I thought Caitlin Moran wrote a good piece in the Times last week, where she sort of said the thing that all of her friends who are mothers say, that their children are all very stressed and anxious. And she sort of suggests, well, is it that they're all stressed and anxious and they all have mental health problems, or is it actually they don't have any money and they don't have any prospects and they need a sense of agency and they need a sense of, she talks about when she was 16, she reads her diary and she's very stressed out, and then she moves to London and sort of starts having quite a nice time, and sort of because she's able to kind of do stuff for herself, which feel, she says, they're not anxious, they're broke. And I think that's probably pretty accurate in a sort of general way. And also I just wanted to mention, because I've read it, so I'm going to have to tell you about it, Alison Pearson's column yesterday, because she had the same idea as us to talk about this survey. And it's interesting, she came at it from a slightly different angle. She talks about how, of course, we're all sad because the world, we're not allowed to feel happy about this country, and we're not allowed to, And I just want to quote a couple of things, because I genuinely have not read her full column for a while, and it blew me away. There is a sad, wistful kind of unspoken grief that our nation is being abducted by aliens who are hostile to its history and traditions, who pretty much despise everything we love about Britain, and who work through any means possible, brackets, except democracy, to change and subvert it. Which, I mean, who are these aliens? And then the next paragraph, it reminds me of those parasites scientists have discovered that hijack their host's brain and body. And
tell us what you really think, Alison.
I know. She never stops to wonder whether maybe some of what she's written is making people sad.
Yeah.
We should get a patriotism bell. You can ring it every time that, a right-wing columnist is upset that we're not appreciating Britain enough, and that's why we're all so unhappy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as we did on this show a couple of weeks ago, some of the biggest talking Britain down does come from the comment pages of The Telegraph.
Oh, this is it. It's classic.
Yeah,
everything's terrible. Everyone hates, everything's awful and has been for ages.
Well, could Labour initiate a policy of flags for young people? And that might make, if everyone gets sent a Union Jack, that maybe sort some things out.
Everyone gets sent a Union Jack made of gold. That'd be good, and then they can sell it. And
I think they'd be better off with their give everyone a free owl policy.
Free owl?
Do you not remember this?
No.
This must have been the thick of it.
No. Does nobody? You must remember. No one remembers the free owl.
Was this in a dream that you had, Rachel?
Is this Harry Potter?
This is entirely true that in the 2015 election, they had some intern on the Labour Party social media feed and they tweeted out Labour policy, give everyone a free owl.
Right.
Okay.
And you're all looking at
And
me
yet
like
they
I'm
still
insane.
lost.
Okay,
Yeah, no,
listeners of this podcast, write in
Google
if
it.
you remember this.
Ava, should Labour, not pledge owls to people, but should they try and pledge more happiness on a sort of, Barack Obama hope style campaign, I suppose? Should they actually try and look at this and say, look, we think we could make you more happy?
I don't know. The politics of misery is quite good. It gets you on the front pages, doesn't it? And it gets you into the comment pages as well, as we've just heard. But, one thing about what we were just talking about there with children being miserable, it's also that they're a lot more vocal about how miserable they are, because we spent the last 20 years telling them, you should talk to us about how you feel and you should tell your teacher if you're upset. And then they do that. And then you get a columnist like Alison Pearson who writes things like, this is outrageous, they don't want to work. That is simply what the answer is here. So maybe, if Labour really did carry on with their pledge to put in a mental health advocate into every school in the country, that would be a step towards happiness. Come off of the drugs and actually talk to a therapist. And then when you leave school, you might be happy.
Yeah. I can confirm Labour press team on 19th of June 2014 at 1:52 p.m. did tweet everybody should have his own owl.
Yes!
So Rachel hasn't completely lost the
But
plot
that was
there.
before we all got free broadband. And because we never got universal broadband, not all of us could see that tweet.
No.
I was still on dial-up.
Are you suggesting that the owls should provide the broadband?
Yeah, they were going to be the carriers.
Yeah.
I
I would just like to go back to something vaguely sensible, which is housing and the housing theory of everything. And I really it's not that I think that mass house building would solve literally everything in this country, but I think it would solve an awful lot. And I think not knowing where you're going to be living next month, if you're ever going to be able to own a home, not being able to start the family you desperately want because you're living in a studio or a house share, not being able to have any free cash for anything fun because you're desperately saving for this idea of financial security.
I'm being told by a producer here, our producer Chris, that it is true, the owls, but Labour insiders say their press Twitter account was hacked after the party appeared to commit to it.
would
It was a very popular policy.
Yeah.
That
Who
sounds like
would
Rita
hack?
Ora. Do you remember when Rita Ora tweeted, like, if this gets 1 million likes, I'll release new music?
Yeah.
And then it didn't get 1 million likes. So she just said that her Twitter had been hacked.
We've reached the end of the show, so what are the stories that have gone under the radar in the news this week? Matt, what's yours?
Well, this is a sad story for the creative industries. Vault Festival has announced today that they are closing and cancelling plans for a new London venue. And Vault was a great festival. I went to it several times. I never performed in it, but loads of people I know did. It was a really good festival, sort of fringe festival. It's sort of the equivalent of the Edinburgh Festival for London, like smaller scale, but similarly experimental. And they had this great venue, which was literally the vaults of Waterloo Station.
Oh, I've been there.
Yeah, for a few years. They had it there. And then there was I don't know, I can't remember the exact full story, but there was basically some issue where the people that sort of owned the vaults said, right, you've all got to move out because we're going to put something else in there. And then they sort of never did put anything else in there, but Vault Festival had to move. And they found various other venues, but they had this big plan to set up a big venue. They were fundraising and stuff, but basically they've announced today that they can't raise enough funding. They're having to cancel all their plans. And it's a real shame because I think those kind of festivals are where the new artists come from. You get to try things out, you get to experiment and fail in a sort of relatively small environment. And some great people have started out at Vault. And it's a real shame, and it will make a big impact over the next few years, I think.
Rachel.
Mine is also a somewhat depressing one. We talked about the Lib Dems and sewage and water. Thames Water might go bust or is in serious trouble. And Sarah Olney, the Lib Dem MP, is doing a debate in Parliament on Friday, basically saying, what are the plans for this if the biggest water company in the country goes bust? Thames Water, which has debts of £1.7 billion, is trying to stay solvent and avoid a takeover. And what they want to do is be allowed to pay higher dividends while increasing bills by 40% and have limitations on fines for serious pollution of rivers. So that's going on Friday, and we did a big big podcast on this with Fergal Sharkey, who was brilliant, just talking about the state of the water industry. And it's a personal one for me because I've just moved house. There's a water meter. The water meter says that water is running constantly in the house, and we're losing 12 litres of water an hour, regardless of whether the taps are on or not. And I have called Thames Water about this, and they go, yeah, you've got a leak somewhere in the house. I'm like, well, given that we had the entire plumbing of the house redone, I don't think we have a leak somewhere in the house. I think this might be an issue with you guys. And so far from them, silence.
So mine is, I'm not sure if it's gone really under the radar yet. It's more just that it's quite new, but that ground rent is not legally or commercially necessary, says UK Watchdog. So Britain's competition watchdog has said ground rent is neither legally nor commercially necessary, and the government may need to step in to protect consumers from soaring costs. So yeah, we did a bunker episode about leaseholds with Barry Gardner, who's very angry and passionate about this sort of thing, which was good and worth a listen. And yeah, it's just kind of bollocks, really, isn't it? That people just keep getting more and more charges that can go up.
Do you know this happened to my friend, but just to her balcony? She didn't own her balcony.
Yeah.
And so it broke and she couldn't fix it. And if she wanted to fix it, she just didn't own the leasehold to it. I mean, how astonishing is that? Yeah. She was on the 16th floor.
Leasehold is mad.
Yeah. And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you to Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you to Ava.
Thank you.
And thank you to Matt.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a hearty salute to our generous supporters. You could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. There's also a link in the show notes. We'll see you next time.
Hello, welcome, and huge thanks for your generosity in these straitened times to Mark Norbury, Graham, and Michael Pegg.
Big thanks from me. We really appreciate your support. To Simon Hartley, Margaret Lucy Patterson, and Claire Walkley.
And finally from me, massive thanks for digging down the back of the settee to support your favourite podcast. We are in your debt. Andrew Nunn, R. Logan, I'm not saying that in a sort of Yorkshire accent, it's R, the letter, Logan, and Will Cullum.